don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Anna Stokke, who is a math professor and host of a podcast that focuses on math instruction called Chalk and Talk. Anna and I had a brief Twitter kerfuffle, which led to her blocking me back in April, I think, after which I reached out by email and extended an olive branch and asked her to come on the podcast, and she graciously did so. One of the things that I certainly think is important and to model is to have conversations with folks that you might disagree with. So we started our conversation talking about that exchange and some of the dynamics of social media and the ways in which those play out positively and or negatively in our discussions around things like teaching and learning. And then we got into the discussions about direct or explicit instruction versus inquiry and some of the intricacies and important distinctions and things that we agree on, and then ultimately some of the things that we certainly disagree on. We ended the conversation by addressing some questions that were added on Twitter when I solicited ideas and questions for this conversation. It seems to me the heart of the matter of our differences and disagreements in this conversation center around academic outcomes and efficiency and the importance of those things and the prioritization of those things, and they might be related to the different kinds of content that we specialize in. I wasn't trying to convince Anna of anything, nor was she trying to convince me of anything, but just trying to explore those differences and distinctions I hope will be helpful for you as you think about teaching and learning in your classroom. I'd like to thank Anna once more for agreeing to come on the podcast and for being willing to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with her, because I think that's absolutely essential in our pursuit of better teaching and learning. If you like what you hear, please share our podcast and our work, which you can find at wegrowteachers.com. All of our blog pieces and this podcast can be found there, as well as the usual places like Apple Podcasts. And our professional development work is there as well, which includes lots of project-based learning and knowledge-rich inquiry workshops and differentiated instruction and much more, including our objective pluralism work and workshops, which is meant to foster more heterodox thinking and learning and conversations, of which I hope this conversation is a good example. Again, that's wegrowteachers.com. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything you'd like to share with me, my email is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. I'd like to make it clear how much I appreciate Anna for joining me on this podcast. It took a little bit of humility on my part to reach out, and certainly was great that she was willing to engage with me after what seemed to be a pretty tendentious exchange. It's so easy to get wrapped up in that us versus them mindset that our culture is engulfed in, and we've got to get away from that and really get towards more heterodox thinking and conversations. And with all of that said, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Anna Stokke. I am with Anna Stokke, and she's going to tell us a bit about herself, and I will have done a somewhat, hopefully, useful intro, but I'm sure you can give a much better background of who you are. We're going to talk about some interesting things around teaching and learning and interactions and online discussions and things like that. But welcome, Anna. Thanks for joining me. And yeah, what is it like? How do you describe yourself? What are the things that are important about you? Some of our folks that are listening will likely know who you are. Others will not. So yeah, who are you?
Sure. So, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really happy to be here talking to you today, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm a math professor. I work in the math and statistics department at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. I have a PhD in math. So professionally, I am a mathematician. I do research in math, and I teach math at the university level. I'll mention that I've won several teaching awards and awards for educational leadership and community service, including a 3M National Teaching Fellowship, which is the highest award for post-secondary teaching excellence and educational leadership in Canada. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of K to 12 math outreach. So that's probably why I'm here today and how you know about my work. And I've been doing that for around 15 years. So I host a podcast on math education. It's called Chalk and Talk. I co-founded a nonprofit after-school math program for kids, and that's been running for over 10 years now. And that's volunteer work I do in the community. I designed all the lessons. My husband designed some of the lessons too, and I hire university students to teach the classes, so that's ongoing. At one point, I also co-founded an advocacy group to improve math education. We did have some impact on the curriculum here, though not a lot. So that's me in a nutshell.
Great. And sometimes I think this can be helpful in these conversations. What was your sort of educational experience like as a child growing up? What kind of education, progressive, more traditional, those kinds of things did you experience?
Okay, that's a good question. So I grew up in rural Manitoba in a very small farming community. And that was really mostly in the 80s, my education. So it was probably quite traditional. The focus would have been mostly on skills in my school. It was a very small school. Teachers taught many different subjects. They wouldn't have been math experts by any means. For high school, I went to a school in Brandon, Manitoba. I think it was a fairly good education. We didn't have access to things like math contests. I'd never even heard of something like that. But I feel in general that I got a fairly good education. I should mention that my mother is good at math. She has a chemistry degree, and she was a chemistry teacher. So that probably influenced how I felt about math as well, because she really loved math. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And then as far as university, what was that like? What was your experience as a student in university?
Oh, okay. So I went to Brandon University as an undergraduate student. That's a small liberal arts university here in Manitoba. I think when I showed up there, I felt kind of behind, which I think a lot of students do when they end up in university. But that was probably the first time I saw myself as maybe continuing in math, probably because I had a really good math prof that really encouraged me and invited me to do summer research with him. So that was probably the turning point for me. But I loved university. So I really enjoyed it.
Okay, great. Well, as some folks will likely know who are tuning in, this conversation was not ever supposed to happen because you and I had gone back and forth on a particular Twitter thread, or X thread as it's now known, and it's still Twitter to me, but say no more about that. One of the things that I had posted, and this was back in, let me see if I can pull it up, April 18th of this year, I had a podcast conversation with Dylan William, who was also on your podcast, and I made a post that said I had spoken with Dylan, and that, I come from more of an inquiry perspective. You're obviously much more an advocate of direct instruction, and I offered or sort of said something about like, here's a conversation with Dylan from a different perspective. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't gone back to look at all of it. It was maybe not particularly well received by you, and there was a bit of exchange back and forth, and I think you blocked me. And after that, I reached out because I thought, well, that was odd. I certainly didn't have that intention to be necessarily provocative or adversarial or anything like that, with the caveat that, of course, it's social media and we're talking about some tribalism kinds of things, and there's lots of vitriol and adversarial nature. And full disclosure, I probably had, responded to posts, sometimes maybe with a little snark here or there. So it's easy to get an impression. And anyways, after you blocked me, I saw another post that you had put on the Twixters, the Twitter X's, and mentioned something about, not engaging in those kinds of things and people being a jerk, and it was maybe about me, maybe it wasn't about me, and said something about emailing. So I thought, okay, I'll email. And so I emailed and said, it certainly wasn't my intention, and tried to extend that. I think it was even called the olive branch, and try to find that common ground, because I do think it's really important for folks to not fall into this us versus them trap. And so we had a really pleasant exchange via email, and here we are. You agreed to be on the podcast several months later because of your busy schedule. So is that an accurate reading, as you would see, of kind of the I guess genesis of how we got here?
I guess so. Okay, so I'll say a few things about that.
Yeah.
And I post on Twitter, right? So I'm there to kind of post about my podcast and post about, papers and personal views and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And, people seem to expect me to get into these long Twitter debates. And the truth is, I just don't have time to get into Twitter debates, okay? Mm-hmm. I have a full-time job. I run a nonprofit organization. I'm trying to do math research. And, I have a family, et cetera. And it really sucks up a lot of time. And I feel that it often you don't really get anywhere with it.
Right.
And I also feel that there are a lot of people on Twitter that just try to poke people.
Right.
And, that the goal is to get the person to block them and then just say, and then post something after that says, oh, look, this person blocked me. This is proof that what they're saying doesn't have anything to back it up, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I also think, that people don't always come across on Twitter in a great way. And that may be true of me as well. People don't know me, and I don't know you. I said that to you. I don't know you. I don't know who these people are. Like, you were posting something like saying that my podcast was just showing one side of it and that people should listen to your podcast instead. And I just thought it was kind of, at the time, I felt it was kind of rude. Mm-hmm. And also I don't really want to get on Twitter and start saying nasty things to people either, because it makes me look bad. Mm-hmm. Right. So anyway, enough of that. Right. I'm very delighted that you emailed me. Okay. And anyone's welcome to email me. I'm happy to talk to people. I'm not going to talk to you if I think that you're going to be rude or the purpose is to make fun of me.
Right.
I probably won't, but certainly I'm happy to talk to people if they try to engage with me in a reasonable, professional way.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk about before we get to the teaching and learning and some of the distinctions and things that other people might also be interested in is thinking about these dynamics, because it is a real challenge, right? The ways in which we perceive and make assumptions about people, whether it's me, whether it's you, whether it's others, we're working on from such a limited set of information. And one thing that our interaction highlighted to me, because you responded, I think, as you just said, so I'm not really interested in extended back and forths and don't have the time or those kinds of things. And there are, myself included, maybe to a fault, I do engage in some of those. I'm trying to do that a little bit less, because I think your point is well taken. Like, what are we doing here? Or at least trying to limit some of those interactions to more productive interactions with good faith people. But there's an assumption that, well, if you're on Twitter, everybody is going to go back and forth. And when you don't go back and forth, it's like, well, that's rude, or it's taken as a negative. And so I think it highlighted to me one of those things, and I think I tweeted about it, is like we should recognize that people use this platform or other platforms and engage differently. And one might be frustrated, and somebody said, well, she just pushes stuff out and doesn't engage, and that's disingenuous, or they can characterize it however they want. They certainly do and have. and that's realistic, and it's certainly worth considering, but I shouldn't expect you to engage the exact same way that that I engage. That would be unfair. You're welcome to use the platform however you want. So not even a question there. It's just an observation that really sort of jumped out to me, and I don't know if you have anything you would like to add there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we do have to be careful about how we think about other people, and certainly I can use the platform however I wish. There are no rules about how to use Twitter, as
Sure,
we all know.
Doesn't seem like it.
But I would also say to that, some things that have surprised me, there are people on Twitter that are in the same province as I am that are poking me on Twitter, and I just kind of think, really, like you have something to say to me, why don't you just email me, or even like the university's open, you can come and talk to me, right? So I find those sorts of behaviors odd. I think that also just with social media, someone pointed out to me, it's kind of like road rage. People, like really quiet people, get behind the wheel and they just become this different person, and they become really aggressive.
Yeah.
And so I think we do have to be careful. And I mean, I'm trying really hard not to judge people by the way they tweet, because I also think that a lot of people come across as really aggressive. Sometimes I feel like people are being, even misogynistic, which probably isn't even fair. You just kind of end up thinking like that. But I do think we have to be careful with social media and what we think of other people that we see on there, because we don't really know who we're dealing with.
Yeah. So how would you characterize it? Maybe two questions here. How would you characterize your, I guess, goal? What are you trying to do with your social media presence? Because I think maybe that would help some people better understand your tweets and messages and things like that. And then what do you notice, or any sort of comments that you might have on the sort of tribalism, to the extent that you see it? I see what seems to be a lot of that sort of us versus them, that tribalism and taking sides, and maybe you don't, maybe you see less of it because for a number of reasons. So I'm curious how you see, how would you describe your approach and what you're trying to do and your ultimate goal with social media, and then that sort of us versus them dynamic that you see?
Okay, sure. Okay, so I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter, mostly just to say, look, I have a new podcast episode. Hope you like it. Here's some quotes from the episode. Maybe to tweet about some things I'm seeing that are going on in math. Maybe to tweet about some papers, that sort of thing. And also, actually, I'm there to see what other people are saying. So it gives me an idea of how people think. And it gives me an idea, like there are lots of people that I learn a lot from on Twitter, which I really appreciate. At the end of the day, I don't think I'd leave the platform. I like being there. And I tend to learn a fair bit from it. Okay. So let's talk about tribalism.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So, and it's interesting you mentioned this, because I saw that tweet yesterday. You said, I'm interviewing Anna Stokke tomorrow. And I forget how you put it. You said I was a staunch proponent of direct instruction or something like that.
Vocal advocate.
Oh, is that what you said? Okay, got it. Okay. So, and that is not how I see myself. Okay. So that's interesting that you see me in that way. So here's how I see myself.
Okay.
I am a proponent of students learning math. Okay. And I want more students to learn math. I want more students to be prepared to do higher level math. That is how I see myself. I am a math advocate. Okay. Now, the reason you probably think I'm a direct instruction advocate is because, I tweet a lot about direct instruction, and I have people on the podcast and we talk about direct instruction. That's because I'm looking for the best ways to teach math to close gaps, and so that more students will have access to higher level math. And it tends to come down to direct instruction or explicit instruction. Okay. So I don't know. Tribalism. I mean, I guess you could say that. I think some people are a bit more aggressive about it than others, for sure. I do think, there definitely are sides to this debate. Whether it's going to get any better. I mean, it's been going on for years, right? So there are likely always going to be sides. I mean, we all care about students learning math, but we disagree, I think, in some cases on how to get there.
Yeah. Well, yes, my perception is that you are definitely a vocal advocate for direct or explicit instruction and all of those things that might be consistent with what might be characterized as science of learning. Although if I try to steel man and think about what's the most gracious interpretation of somebody, yourself or anybody, my guess is that, or let me sort of frame it a little differently, right? So if you think about the sort of debate, as it were, you have on one side the sort of more traditional direct or explicit instruction advocate, science of learning, and the other end, all the way at the other end, sort of discovery learning, free school, that kind of thing. And there's lots of space in between. And I say, and I think I said in that tweet, I'm a vocal inquiry advocate. And therein, we talk about those sort of sides. My guess is that you, at least in some ways, shapes, and forms, also would advocate for some forms of inquiry. You wouldn't say inquiry is bad necessarily. And here's where the tribalism, I think, comes in and gets in the way of our discussions in such a destructive, corrosive way, is that there are a number of folks that basically put those two things in, diametric opposition, right? They are adversarial. Your inquiry learning is bad. And this is I've had this conversation online with a few people, and they will say inquiry learning is bad for kids. And my guess is that most people who are interested in kids learning and science of learning will also say, I just spoke with Carl Hendrick, and it should be published by this time, we found lots of common ground. So to say that you're not interested in inquiry would be a mischaracterization, but the perception, because of our tribal us versus them, especially on social media, it makes it seem like direct instruction is the best thing, and inquiry is bad for kids. And I don't know if you see that from other folks, or if you even any reactions to that.
I do have some reactions to that. And it's funny because, I would assume that because I'm a mathematician and, I have a PhD in math and I've published original mathematics papers in good journals, and I've discovered math myself, right? I would assume that people would think that actually I do think that there's value to inquiry because I do it, right? And I've also been very successful in getting students to engage in inquiry. I've published papers with several undergraduate students where they've discovered math themselves, right? So I always find this kind of surprising. And then, and sometimes I even have people writing to me and saying, let me explain to you what inquiry is. And I'm like, really? Like, you think you're going to explain to me what inquiry in math is? Like, I do this all the time, right? So the difference, sort of comes in at the stage at which you want to engage in inquiry-based learning, right? So that seems to be sort of the sticking point. I'm 100% not, I am absolutely not opposed to inquiry learning. I don't think it works well if you're going to use it with novice learners, right? So I think, and I suppose for students in school, I'm more of the opinion that I'd like to see them be able to solve complex problems, right? So I'd like to see them get to that point where they can solve complex problems.
Sure.
But I think what is happening a lot is people want to start with complex problems because that's where we want to get. And that's going to be really hard to do unless you have a solid foundation from the stuff that comes before that, right? So I think that it's a matter of where to introduce what you're calling inquiry or, problem solving.
Yeah. Well, and to sort of piggyback on that, or to build on that. So I think it's important, and I've written about this and try to talk about this, not to straw man the direct or explicit instruction side. I am an advocate also for direct or explicit instruction. I just ran a project-based learning workshop, and we talked a lot about direct or explicit instruction. You probably have seen or are aware of the latest book by Engelman about direct instruction handbook, and I was asked to review it and provide a intro blurb, that kind of thing. But so we want to be careful not to mischaracterize or caricature that side and say, well, yeah, of course, you want to engage students in inquiry. It's just a different, it's a matter of efficiency and building that knowledge and having that knowledge from which to build. And I would agree with you not to start with complex problems, start simple and build from there. On the other hand, and what I try to do is be also critical of and say, look, I think there's a valid criticism of inquiry constructivist, progressive educators insofar as they tend to sometimes, not everybody, it's a generalization, and in some ways a caricature, but not necessarily fully. They tend to think, I'm not supposed to teach, I'm not supposed to guide, I'm not supposed to, and they might minimize the role of knowledge. Now, that is what I would say is not good inquiry, teaching, and learning. We want to guide instruction and base that guidance based on what the level is appropriate for them. How much inquiry can they handle, and what are our academic outcomes? On top of that, it's also, I think, we also want to be careful not to conflate discovery learning with inquiry. And this is something that I think lots of folks who are sort of direct or explicit instruction advocates or evangelists, they sort of make that conflation and say inquiry learning is bad because they're saying that's direct instruction. So I think we have to be just much more precise in how we describe or sort of operationalize these terms.
Right. We can be precise, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you and I think it is, right? What matters is what the teachers think it is, the people who are using these techniques, right? And so I do think that there's a conflation between all these things, and that a lot of times teachers feel guilty for actually providing direct instruction because they think they're supposed to be doing inquiry-based instruction. And they may have been told that even by someone that delivered PD, professional development, or a math consultant. I mean, I get lots of messages from teachers who think that they're not supposed to be teaching in a direct way.
Yeah, and we experience that in our workshops as well, because we're sort of on the other side of that. If we want to use sides, we're engaging them in inquiry and really trying to be explicit with them. Yes, you do want to use direct or explicit instruction as appropriate. And I'm curious, how do you feel about we like the framework, and I like the framework that Hattie puts forth as sort of surface deep and transfer, that teaching with intent idea. And so one of the reasons why, and the way he talks about that teaching with intent idea, is to sort of, I think, get us through or sort of dispel, get away from this argument of what's better, direct instruction or inquiry. And we want to really think about what are our desired academic outcomes. Are we aiming for surface, deep, or transfer learning? And at that point, then that would help us in terms of what we would use as our instructional approach, whether it's direct or explicit instruction or inquiry exercises or collaborative activities and that kind of thing. Does that framework make sense to you, or do you prefer something different?
Well, I don't even know what it means. So let's talk about this for a minute. So what do you mean by surface, deep, or transfer learning?
All right. So surface are things that might be just if you want to use Bloom's taxonomy as a simple heuristic or guide here, the basic understand and remember pieces, the content knowledge, so something like in social studies, I was a social studies teacher. What are the three branches and levels of government and checks and balances? One could know that as a set of facts, right? Definitions, and maybe even illustrate it, and just a basic understanding. Deep, you might then take it a little more deeply and say, by posing a question, perhaps an inquiry exercise might be, does our executive branch in the United States have too much power, or anywhere, but that's what I would be teaching is United States government principles. Does the executive branch have too much power based on what we know of those things, and sort of exploring that, which would mean you'd have to really think deeply about the interconnectedness and the relatedness and those kinds of things. And then you might transfer it into, does Canada or Singapore, does the executive branch have more power than is healthy or something like that?
Okay, and then transfer?
Yeah, so the transfer
being able
is,
to transfer the
to another country, something like that. So
okay. So being able to transfer the skill into a new situation.
Right.
That's kind of what you mean. Okay. So I actually am kind of keen on the instructional hierarchy right now. So I have a great interview coming out with Brian Ponce. I'm a big fan. So he's a psychologist and he does work on math interventions. Okay. So the instructional hierarchy is, are you familiar with it?
I'm not.
Okay. So let me just quickly explain this. Okay. So it's got 4 components.
Okay.
The first is acquisition or accuracy. Okay. So that's the stage at which a student is first learning a new skill. Okay. And so they don't know that skill yet, and you're trying to teach it to them. And at that stage, the student requires a lot of direct instruction, right? A lot of modeling of the problem, corrective feedback, etc. Okay. Now, once the student is accurate, you can move on to fluency. And fluency is the stage at which, okay, the student knows what they're doing, but they're very slow, right? So in math, that would mean like you could solve like an algebra problem, but it takes you a really long time and you're really thinking through the steps and all that sort of thing. And we do want to be able to do things relatively quickly because it makes things easier for us later, right? So now at the fluency stage, you build fluency, okay? And you do that through lots of practice, okay? Practice is really important in math. After fluency comes, hang on, I got to check that one. Oh yeah, generalization, okay? So I think you are talking about things like what you're calling deep transfer. I think they would call generalization and adaptation. So at the generalization stage, the students are accurate, they're fluent, but they might confuse the skill with another similar skill, right? So they might get, I give them a problem they're supposed to add, and then I give them one they're supposed to subtract, and they get the two mixed up because they're similar if you're just learning, right? So at that stage, you need to provide students with a lot of opportunities to look at different types of problems that are actually similar so that they learn to differentiate, right? So interleaving that'd be a good place to introduce interleaving, where students are looking at problems that are similar and they have to figure out a strategy for how to do those, right? Okay, now after that comes adaptation. Now your students are able to perform that skill there fluently and accurately and apply it to new situations independently, right? And so I think that that's what you're talking about. So I would see this as a progression. And where you want to get to is that adaptation that adaptation stage, right? You want independent learners who can think for themselves, who can solve complex problems. The problem that I see is I think that a lot of times we're not spending enough time on the acquisition and fluency stage. And it's therefore difficult for students to get to the generalization and adaptation stage. So that's what I think about this. I mean, we don't want just surface learning for sure. We want students to be able to apply the skills that we teach them and the knowledge that we give them in novel situations. Right. But they need a lot of practice, like in math, a lot of practice to build fluency.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm curious about a couple of threads here. One, which is the teaching of math and the importance of fluency, efficiency, versus something a little more, I guess, open-ended or different, social studies, or humanities, something like that, which isn't as, I guess there's not the same dynamic of knowing your math facts and things like that. I think there is something to knowing 3 levels of government and branches so that you have some fluency there. So I want to pull on that thread, but before we do that, so when getting to the adaptation phase, and this was instructional, what was the second word in the
Hierarchy.
Hierarchy. Okay,
It's
that's what
called
I
the
thought it was.
instructional hierarchy.
Right. So with the instructional hierarchy and getting to that generalization and the adaptation phase, let's assuming that they have done the practice and the interleaving and things like that, that have built the first two phases and maybe into the third. What do you recommend, and how do you think teachers should work on building that sort of fourth adaptation stage, and what role does inquiry might maybe play in that?
Okay, so that stage is really hard, right? So the general, it's, and any math teacher will tell you this. They'll say, okay, I taught my students this skill, and then on the test, I changed the problem slightly, and they said they had no idea how to do it. They'd never seen anything like it before. And to you, the problem looks just to be a slight alteration, and you can't believe it, right?
Right.
That's the curse of knowledge, because it's really hard when you know something to imagine that someone else can't see it, right?
Right.
And so it's really important to give students a lot of different types of opportunities at that stage. Okay, so first of all, they do have to be fluent, right? Or else this is going to be really complicated for them.
Right.
Is there a place for inquiry there? Okay, so what do you mean by that, first of all?
Well, I'm not sure exactly, because I'm curious how you might see inquiry in that process, and how you would, and maybe you don't. And I'm not a math teacher by trade, so I can imagine asking them. I don't. It's hard for me to sort of really speak with much fluency about the math problems and stuff that you're referring to.
Yeah, that's okay.
But the idea that you might ask them to, really compare and contrast, or I'm not doing it justice here, but that inquiry process, which can look a lot of different ways, right? Could be deeper or different. There's different types of ways that we can inquire, and different kinds of questions.
Okay.
Looking at a number of different, you have you have built these skills of understanding this formula, maybe there's 5 different formulas or math techniques, and then asking them to solve a problem, and which one of those might be the best formula to do that, right? They would have to really think deeply about that. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good stage to do those things you're talking about. Okay, so here's a problem that we do in my after school program, and we teach the students the standard algorithms, and we teach them to mastery, and our students are really good at them. Okay, so now they're there, they know this stuff really well. Okay, so here's a couple problems. So 9 plus 9 is 18, right? Okay, so here's some more problems. What's 99 plus 99? Okay, well, that's 198. And maybe the student will use the standard algorithm, but maybe you might want to ask them, was that the best technique to use in that situation, right? Because sometimes it's not the best technique to use, right? It might have been better to say, well, that's 100 plus 100 minus 2. I get 198, right? Okay, next, what about 999 plus 999? Okay, well, your answer there is 1,998, right? And can you keep going? And what do you think? And I'm not asking you, don't worry.
Please don't.
What do you think? Yeah, I know, don't worry. What do you think the next answer is going to be? And how far can you go with this, right? How far can you predict, and what's going on, right? So that's the type of problem that would be good after the fluency stage, right? And I'm trying to keep this really basic. So what else could you do? Well, you're working on addition, right? So we're working on, standard algorithm, let's say. And I say, can you come up with, 2 4-digit numbers that you add, and you have to carry only once? What about only twice, right? What about 3 times? Okay. And, also, what about none, right? And so it gets them thinking, and sorry for using the word carry. I hope that nothing blows out here. I should have said regroup, I know. Okay. So it gets them thinking about what they're doing when they're using the standard algorithm, and it gets them thinking about mathematical patterning, right? So for sure, I definitely see value to those problems, and I would want to see students doing these types of problems. But I do think that it's going to be hard for students to see these patterns and to figure out what's going on if they aren't fluent with addition in the first place, if they don't know their math facts and that sort of thing. And I think that's part of the problem, is that people want to start with these problems. They seem really fun. They seem fun to the adults in the room, and we'll all feel really good if we do this stuff. And there's like a buzz in the room and people are talking and blah, blah, blah. But when you have students in the class who don't even know that 9 plus 9 is 18, and they're like counting on their fingers,
right.
And then there's students in the class who are really quick. This isn't a fun experience for those students who don't know their math facts or don't have the background knowledge, right? So it's important to get students to a spot where they actually can look at those problems. And that's why it's important to assess, to know where the students are at in the instructional hierarchy, to sort of figure out what kinds of problems to give them and what kind of instruction to use.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with any of that. As a matter of fact, I can give you an example. And we talk about the difference between not making the mistake of just seeking behavioral engagement, but also making sure there's cognitive engagement, right? And I think that's something that sometimes teachers on the inquiry side tend to make a mistake in. Like, oh, the kids, like you said, they're enjoying it, they're having fun, they're engaged, they're not bored, quote unquote, right? And I can tell you, my daughter, I have two daughters, 15 and 17 now, and my youngest, I remember her coming home and saying, we were doing something in math, and she's not a great mathematician, and so, well, teacher had us go to the whiteboard, and we're in groups, and we're at the whiteboard doing problems, and she said one girl in her group knew it and knew how to do it, and she didn't, and that was not assessed. The teacher didn't know, apparently, according to my daughter, and she never tells lies. She never misrepresents anything, so clearly this was accurate, right? No, but the idea that she was at this board with her, 2 or 3 or whatever, however many in her group, and one person was doing the math and understanding it, and the teacher made the mistake that, they were up, they were moving, but wasn't assessing whether each person in that group was getting the math. And so I think that's an example. We want to make sure that we're not going just for that behavioral engagement, but also making sure that we're checking and doing the cognitive engagement, and that those students do know what they're doing and building that fluency. So let me return to the earlier thread that I sort of mentioned, and maybe frame it in this way. So one thing that I wonder about, and I've asked this question in a couple different conversations, is you're obviously a math expert. That's your area of expertise. And I wonder how much of this is, I guess, flavored by the differences in teaching of math versus, again, teaching of social studies or things like that, humanities, where it might be just a difference in outcomes and what you're after, academic outcomes, a little bit more quantitative and less qualitative. One of the conversations I had with somebody that, was like, I said, how do you get to the solving and working through of open-ended problems? And the reframing, the response was essentially talking about an ill-defined problem, which is different. An ill-defined problem, you could use direct or explicit instruction and teach kids what's the right algorithm or heuristic to use. An open-ended problem may not have a right answer and may have several different answers. And so I'm curious if you think about the differences in sort of academic disciplines and how this sort of conversation plays out, what your thoughts are about that.
Okay, so I won't weigh in on other subjects. I am a mathematician. I'm a math professor. I know a lot about teaching math. I know nothing about teaching other subjects. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I won't weigh in on that. But I'll tell you a few things about math from my experiences, sort of trying to explain things to people outside the field, even within my own university when we're designing courses. And I think something that people often underestimate with math is that it's really cumulative. So I think sometimes, when you're in English or something like that, you can pick up a novel and you're doing that novel study, and what you did before doesn't matter, right? Like it doesn't rely on that. In math, it's not like that.
Right.
So basically, you learn something, and when you're going to learn that thing, you need to know all the things that come before it. So you're going to solve an algebra problem. You better be very fluent working with integers, right? Or working with fractions, et cetera. And if you're not, that's going to cause you a lot of trouble. It's really going to slow you down. And it can really snowball. So it can get out of control really quickly. And so this probably is one of the biggest differences between math and a lot of other subjects. And, a lot of times, and I say this to students at the beginning of my class all the time, is that, you might be confused and maybe you think you're stupid, but it's not that. It's that you didn't master that content before, and that's probably not your fault, but you do have to master that content in order to move on, right? Like, so that's one thing I would say about it. I don't know. What was your other question? Did you have something else specific?
Well, I was it just strikes me as that a lot of the, I guess, disagreements and somewhat contentious conversations I have about this tend to be with folks who are math or science teachers, and it really does make me wonder. I guess, just that the differences, as you mentioned, there's a cumulative sense, there's a real hard science, quantitative versus qualitative kind of things. One of the things that was a question that was, as I solicited on Twitter, was, what are some of the questions? And one person had said, how do you define learning? And of course, one definition that a lot of science learning talks about is change in long-term memory. I don't know how you feel about that, but the sense of the word of efficiency, which I think is really relevant in math and maybe less so in something like, English literature or humanities or social studies, like that kind of thing. So maybe it's best to reframe that question. And when I asked John Hattie this when I talked with him, but I hear the words best or effective or those kinds of things, which is also often used around direct or explicit instruction. It's the best way. It's the most, evidence shows it's the most effective. What I hear is efficient, at least in part of that definition, which seems really relevant to math, but maybe less so, at least in certain circumstances, with other academic disciplines.
Okay, so about efficiency, and now you mean efficiency in doing a math task, right? You're not talking about if efficiency in terms of, is this the most efficient way to teach?
No, I think,
just to be clear.
Well, probably both, but I'm thinking more on the latter, right? So direct or explicit instruction is the most efficient way to build knowledge and fluency and those kinds of things.
Well, of course, it would be the most efficient way to build knowledge, right? Because if you're letting students sort of flail around and they don't know what they're doing,
right,
that's going to take a long time. There's going to be a lot of misconceptions and that sort of thing, right? So it makes sense to me that it is the most efficient way to teach.
Right,
That's
and I'm not
true.
arguing that it isn't.
Yeah. Yes.
So I guess my question, my wonder is, how are there... I pose the question, are there other things that are desirable academic outcomes other than efficiency? Because I acknowledge, and I think that most educators would say efficiency is an important piece, and maybe more so in the math and science realm, quantitative kinds of things, but maybe less so. And that determining of what are we trying to get from our students, and sometimes efficiency may not be the most important thing in getting to our desired academic outcome. It often could be, and very well should be, but not necessarily, because I think that's one of the things that gets lost in this discussion. We talk past each other and say direct or explicit instruction is the best because on the side, they're basically saying it's the most efficient. Okay, but there are other things that we might want to engage, ways that we engage our students as thinkers that might not necessarily be that efficient. Does that make sense?
I think so. I do want to say something just in terms of efficiency, in terms of being able to do math skills efficiently.
Yeah.
Okay, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Because this is actually a really important thing. And, if you think of one student who can do 6 times 7 is 42 really quickly, right? And you think of another student who's counting on or using a strategy to get 6 times 7, right?
Right.
And now you're at a different stage where you're asking students to factor a polynomial and they've got to use 6 times 7. Which student do you think is going to find this easier? And which student is going to enjoy that task, right? So there are lots of important reasons for efficiency in math.
Yes.
We call that economy of thought. And so first of all, we want efficient procedures, right? And we want students to be able to do things relatively quickly, and we can get students there. Now, as far as that goes, I think there's some research that is showing that the more fluent students are, the easier it's going to be, and the more likely they will be to do well in that adaptation generalization stage that we talked about. And so again, I'm going to say listen to Brian Ponce because he talks about some of that research. So I think that, in fact, to get to that stage that we want to get to, we have to have the efficiency, right? So I think it's going to make us more likely to get there. Okay. Now, I don't know, on the other thing, I don't know if I'm quite hearing you correctly, but I'm sort of kind of getting some sort of implication that, and you can correct me if I'm
Sure.
wrong, that direct instruction, maybe in your mind, doesn't get us to certain types of learning that we want or certain types of outcomes that we want from students. Are you saying something like that?
It may or it may not, but not necessarily so, or it may not be the quote unquote, I guess, best way. If you're going to wrestle with an open-ended question, it may be very inefficient to use inquiry or collaboration and to really sort of wrestle with it. And of course, we get into cognitive load theory and all those kinds of things and the issue of productive struggle. But there is some real value, I would assert, in wrestling with something in a very inefficient way where somebody's not providing that very direct or explicit instruction. It's not efficient. Recognizing that, and I agree with you, efficiency is often really important in lots of different ways. But I think about the ways in which I have learned things on my own and really struggled to do that, whether I'm watching YouTube videos or problem solving, fixing something in my house. I could have somebody come in and do that more efficiently and explicitly instruct me. But the ways in which I have thought about it and had to think about it, again, very inefficiently, has really crystallized that learning and that process in ways that it might not have. There are other benefits and values than explicit direct instruction might get to. Okay,
gotcha. So now I see what you're saying. Okay. So you think that in the process of inquiry and being able to struggle with something, you get more out of it maybe than being directly told.
You might, yeah.
You might, and you also might not, right? So this might be an extremely frustrating experience for a student in front of their peers, right? And some students might have no difficulty with that problem because maybe they've been taught the skills needed for that problem at home. They race through it, and you have these students stuck there not even knowing where to begin, right? So I question the value of this. I mean, I think there's value to it if the students already have a high level of expertise in the subject area. Okay, I think certainly, like I have a student right now that's doing that, to be honest, because I have a summer research student and she's working on a problem. I don't know the answer to the problem. She doesn't know the answer to the problem. It could be quite difficult and she's struggling through it, right? Um, but she also knows a lot, right? Like she has a high level of expertise. So I question the stage at which you should use that. And I would question how frequently you should use that procedure. I think maybe really advanced students that could benefit, but I don't think for students who are, who have weak basic skills. So first of all, I don't think it's going to help them. And second of all, I think it's wasted time because they should be spending the time actually getting fluent in the areas that will help them advance to a level like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that gets to the definition of learning, right? And would you define it differently from a change in long-term memory?
I would define it as a positive change in long-term memory.
Okay.
Because I don't want, forgetting to be part of the definition. So, by the way, the behaviorists have a different definition for this.
And that is?
A change in behavior. And that's because they would say that you have to be able to see it. The student has to be able to tell you that they've learned. They have to, whether it be, they write it down or they say it verbally or something like that. They have to be able to see it.
Interesting. Well, my assertion and I think this might, again, really be highly related to the differences in where it might, again, math and quantitative kinds of things versus things that are more open-ended, like a social studies or psychology kind of concept. I taught psychology, and I think that those positive changes in long-term memory, those kinds of things that you're mentioning are important, but I think that there are other desirable academic outcomes outside of just building, in this case, math, understanding, and fluency and ability. The ability to think critically, to analyze, to evaluate, to apply those things to different scenarios and settings, to solve and wrestle with open-ended questions, to demonstrate intellectual virtues. Some of those things I think it's really important, and in some cases valuable, to have students wrestle. I take your point. We don't want to have them in a classroom where they're struggling with a math problem where some students are really not struggling. That's not what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about more open-ended kinds of questions, more inquiry kinds of things, project-based learning settings where we are maybe having some inefficiency, and because you have to then think, okay, so what do I need to know here? That's a big piece of our project-based learning work, is to help students be able to frame problems better and more accurately with questions. What do I need to know? What do I need to learn? And as opposed to a direct or explicit instruction setting where it might be more, or it should be more efficient, and the teacher would say, here's what you need to know, let me teach this to you, and let's reduce that friction, that productive struggle. Does that help at all?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, some of these things you mentioned might be difficult to measure.
Yeah,
right?
And they are.
It's okay.
Which is
so
a sticking point in the conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. But let's just talk, for instance, about thinking critically and being able to ask questions. Mm-hmm. So first of all, when you're the teacher, you should really make sure that your students are encouraged to ask a lot of questions, mm-hmm. right? So be open to questions and answer the questions, no matter what the question is. Just make it seem like this is a great question, mm-hmm. and encourage students to ask questions. Asking questions is important, okay? Now, what is it that makes a person into the type of person who can think critically, who can go into a situation and ask questions? Okay, well, I would say you're knowledgeable in the area that you're going to ask questions in.
Sure.
Okay. And you're also confident. Okay.
Right.
So for example, have you ever gone and seen a financial advisor and they try to make you feel really stupid? That's what I think. And and the whole idea is you're supposed to invest in all these things, and only they know the secret language.
Right.
And if you don't do that, you're not going to make any money, and blah blah blah. So when I go to the financial advisor, I say, I don't believe you. I think that isn't the best thing to invest in, because why would I pay this really high management fee when I could just I could do self-investing,
right,
and invest in something else, right? And okay, why do I do that? Well, it's not because like I've engaged in inquiry. I do discovery in math. Like, that has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the fact that I know a lot of math, and I'm confident enough because of that knowledge to question the person on it, right? So I think that being a type of person who's going to ask questions in a particular situation has a lot to do with your knowledge base. Now, there are other situations where I probably wouldn't ask questions because I wouldn't feel confident enough to, because I don't know enough about the subject.
Right. Okay. So this might be a point of disagreement. I think this is a point of disagreement. So I would agree that, yes, the knowledge and understanding is really important and helpful. And that's true. I was having this conversation with teachers this week. If you don't have a really great understanding of your content, you're going to really struggle to be a great teacher because you don't know what are the important questions and concepts, to really draw on. And I take your point in terms of going to the financial advisor. You have that confidence, you have enough knowledge that you can accurately and more precisely ask questions. Now, putting yourself in a novel situation where you don't have that confidence and understanding, I would argue that I would be fine and generally will ask those questions, and you can start with surface questions and then start to dig a little bit more and think about the entire picture, like, okay, what is this person really saying, and really doing that analysis and evaluation and starting to put those pieces together in ways that just having knowledge or it just really strikes me that there's a skill set and a mindset of being able to be skeptical and inquiring in ways that are things that we want to build and facilitate and model for our students. I think I have ability to do that even in situations where I'm not very knowledgeable, and I think that I have built that skill intentionally over the years, and I want to build those skills and mindsets in my daughters, right? So that when they are in novel situations where they may not have that confidence, that they have that ability to analyze and think critically to start turning the pieces of the Rubik's Cube, if that makes sense.
Right. So I feel like, let's do a plug for math and logic then, because this is it's really good training for critical thinking, because you learn how to pick apart arguments, right? You learn when, if this is an illogical argument, we can spot it right away, right? So, I mean, I'm not so sure you like, okay, so first of all, I'm not disputing the value of inquiry learning, just to put that clear, to make that clear. I'm just not so sure it's necessary for what you're saying. Yeah. I think that, as a parent, or as you talked about, I mean, I always tell my kids to be skeptical. Don't believe things people tell you necessarily, right? And as a teacher, you can encourage questioning. Sure. And you can teach kids when you're doing direct instruction, how do you ask the next question? How do you think someone would have come up with this algorithm, right? Can we follow the steps through? Like, what might their thinking have been, right? Without actually making them discover it for themselves, which is, like you say, really inefficient. So anyway, I mean, yeah, maybe we slightly disagree on this, but and that's fine. But yeah, I just think that you can encourage critical thinkers in other ways through direct instruction, for instance, and knowledge. Yeah. And confidence. Like
Yeah.
the main thing is in math, like you want students to be confident in math because they'll want to do more math, right? And and when I mean confidence, I don't mean fake confidence. I mean confidence built through actually being able to do math, real math.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, like you said, we can disagree, and it is, I think, interesting. That is I think, the crux of it. And I'm not here to persuade you. It's not the point of this conversation. It is to sort of, unpack some of those distinctions. It strikes me, and one of the things that I find frustrating about the sort of science of learning, I talked about this with Carl Hendrick, and we had a great conversation, the sort of rigidity and narrowness of what seems to be, and I say seems, doing a lot of work there, because I don't think it's actually true. It's just the sort of messaging and perception that I get from those folks is that there's a narrowness and rigidity on acceptable and desirable academic outcomes, which are on things that are eminently quantifiably measurable and build that knowledge, of which I say yes, and I would say that there's a set of desirable academic outcomes beyond. And actually, you're articulating some of them too. And I think it's also important not to caricature, because people will straw man direct or explicit instruction and say, well, there's no inquiry. It's just drill and kill. Or somebody said to me recently, sit and spit, which I thought was much more graphic and visceral. But it shouldn't be that, right? There are steps and how you engage students in direct or explicit instruction. There are ways you can build some of those skills that you're mentioning. So maybe feel free to comment on that. But there's a couple questions I thought maybe were a little bit unrelated that I might pose before we jump off here. Is there anything you want to say in reaction before we get to those questions?
Not really. I think I'm okay. I do sort of, I do think with these sort of, I would call them fuzzy phrases like critical thinking and 21st century skills and these types of things. We do have to be careful with them because they are things you can't measure. And when they're things you can't measure and people say, well, to get that thing, you have to do this. We have no way of knowing whether it's true or not, right? So that's sort of my issue.
Well, yeah. I would say they're harder to measure, and sometimes I wish I had resources to study this. I would argue that, or it seems intuitively true to me, which is not consistent with science of learning kinds of mindsets, right? That there are things that we work on throughout the development of a child which are not necessarily quantifiably right away, but will lead to them crystallizing down the road in terms of when somebody's further developed and has more knowledge and has more wisdom, and those pieces start to come together. And if we don't work on those things in sort of the K-12 realm, that they are much less likely to crystallize.
Okay, that's the math teacher argument, right?
Okay.
What's this good for? Well, you can't see it right now, but this is teaching you to think critically, and it's gonna help you later, and it probably does, right? But who knows?
Right. Okay. So a couple of questions that I solicited on the Twitter X's. One, which was, I hope I'm getting this right. The question was something about certain demographics where, in either of our experiences, certain methods have worked better. I'm not sure exactly if I understand it correctly. I asked for a clarification. Does that make sense to you? Are there certain demographics and groups that you would take different instructional approaches with?
No, but there are other people who would do that. And I'm happy to talk about this issue because, it's the reason I'm in this space. So when my kids were in school, we noticed that they weren't actually learning a lot of math in school. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think sometimes, and we're sitting here having this high level conversation about inquiry learning versus direct instruction. Right. And I think what actually often happens in schools a lot because they think they're supposed to be using inquiry, or they think they shouldn't be using direct instruction. The kids just end up not getting a lot of practice. Okay. And that to me is really what's holding them back. Okay. So that's what I saw. And so my husband's also a mathematician. We started teaching our kids math. We had to, because we're not going to let our kids get behind in math, because we know it's important. And so what happens when you have these situations and the schools aren't serving everyone is that the parents who can will self-insure, right? They'll take their kids to Kumon, and Kumon's going to get them to do a whole bunch of practice, right? And then their kids are better, or if they can, they'll help their kids. And then that leaves the other kids who don't have parents who can look out for them behind, okay? So I think there really is an important issue regarding equity, and I think that it's really important that we have to get this right. Like, we have to, you must assume that the parents can't help, and that your teaching has to actually work for all the kids in that class that aren't getting help at home. Okay, so I think, and I do think direct instruction and building fluency is a really important piece of that. So the other thing I want to say about equity, okay, so first of all, I would say in this space that there are some people who have an instructional ideology that they want to push, and so they will use demographics as fake evidence to push the ideology. So for example, and I'm going to speak about females because I'm a woman in math, and we are underrepresented when you go up the levels in math. So I have heard people say that girls should be taught differently. And there is no evidence for that whatsoever, right? And it comes down to they should be taught using these particular methods that individual would like to push in schools, okay? So I have a big problem with that. And because in fact, if you pull out the traditional math and girls don't have access to that, they're going to be shut out of careers in math, okay? Because it's that traditional math content that actually gets us up to calculus and things like that open all the doors, okay? So I have a problem with that. The second thing is there are some people who actually believe that certain demographics can't perform as well in math. That is a very big problem. I don't know if this happens in reading, but it definitely happens in math. And I mean, probably the worst instance I saw of this. So I was constantly advocating for better math standards for teachers who were training to be elementary school teachers in my province. Okay, so I wanted them to take more math so that they knew more math when they went to the schools. So my colleague and I are at a meeting, and there are two math educators there, and they're both men. My colleague's a female, and she's brilliant. And one of them says something along the lines of, well, the problem is that the elementary education, so the elementary educators the classes are mostly populated by females, and they tend not to be as into math content. And that really struck me, because it was then that I realized, okay, so that's why our standards are so low, because they actually believe that the students can't do it. And somehow they put female into this. And keeping in mind that my colleague and I are sitting there, and we both have PhDs in math, we can mop the floor with both of them mathematically, right? And thinking that if they're going in and they're actually teaching these teachers, and they have this in their mind. So this is a really big problem, So I think that we need to have high expectations for students. I don't think we should be pigeonholing students. I think we should have high expectations for all of our students. All right. So and I also think, that we need to encourage students who are less confident. So what I observe a lot is that quiet students, they often don't look out for themselves. They don't They don't ask for help when they're in groups. I often call them sometimes the strong and wrong take over, and there's a quiet person who actually knows how to do the things but is too shy to say anything. And so I think we have to really look out for those students, and we need to offer them opportunities. Like if there's an advanced class, reach out to that student who's doing well in their class, but they're too shy to ask, because I think the people who are really confident just will ask and look out for themselves. So those are a couple of things I'd say about that.
Yeah. Well, one thing that that made me think about is sort of the culturally responsive teaching, and I don't know if this is what the question was sort of addressing. And I would in general agree with you. Say, look, if we think about how students learn across the board, there's essentially not much difference, and demographics wouldn't make a big difference. But it does strike or sort of begs the question, and it made me think of one of the things that Dylan Williams said in my conversation with him, and I put this out on Twitter, but essentially sort of paraphrasing him, he's talking about discovery learning. He's willing to stipulate that there's some benefit to that in terms of how students might learn. It's not efficient, so on and so forth. Direct and explicit instruction is very important. Obviously, he believes that. You've talked with him, that. But also the idea of something like inquiry or project-based learning also being important, because we want to engage students in rich, sort of thoughtful ways that sometimes can be lost in a more traditional approach. And that sort of begs the question, I think I'm making a connection here about demographics and culture, and math can be really sort of cold, hard facts, but are there things that how do you think about that sort of culturally relevant and bringing things in that might, pull them behaviorally engaged, get their attention, capture their imagination, that is relevant to their sort of demographic?
Okay, so you're talking about inclusion and making people feel included, right?
Yeah, in a way that would capture their imagination and activate their interest.
Yeah. Okay. So I agree with that. I think that makes sense to me. But at the end of the day, you can't replace the math with it, though, right? Like you actually have to learn the math. Like that's the part that's going to get the students success. Okay. So yeah, no, I don't have a problem with those kinds of things you're talking about. Yeah, that's
okay. One of the other questions was, and you probably can speak, or hopefully you can speak to this much more than I. What's the right age for kids to have their own math ideas? And I asked for a little bit more clarification on that, and the person said their own names, definitions, articulations of things, their own strategy towards a problem or algorithm, steps to follow. That kind of thing. It would strike me that we wouldn't want to encourage that necessarily, but you're the more math expertise than me.
Sorry, Drew, you went through that a little too fast for me. So their own names,
their own names, definitions, articulations of things, own strategy toward a problem or algorithm / steps to follow. I think DI inquiry differ on how much latitude to give, when, and why. Interesting in this person's opinion, with pedagogy implications.
Okay, so first of all, mathematical definitions are just that. They're definitions. So you can't change definitions, right? So, I mean, I say this because it's interesting. I once saw this video of a discovery learning lesson. And basically the whole lesson was based on the students coming up with the definition of an even number. Well, like, it's already defined, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. Okay. So now about some of these other things. Okay. So of course, I think students can have their own mathematical ideas at any age. All right. I just think they have to have the background in order to do that. So that problem I talked about earlier with addition, How would the students do that if they don't know anything about addition, right? But looking for patterns and things like that, and encouraging students to look for patterns, trying to come up with an algorithm for doing something. Those are all good things to think about, and they're good ways to encourage mathematical thinking. I would say there is no age limit on it, provided that the math that you're looking at is, that the student actually can contribute to that. Because how can they contribute to a question, an open-ended question, say about perimeter, if they don't really know what perimeter is, right? If they haven't done a bunch of problems with perimeter.
Yeah.
So I would say, again, go back to the instructional hierarchy and think where they're at, and then definitely engage with those types of problems.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe one last question. This is not one from Twitter, but one that personally comes from me. So as you think about the conversation and the things, we've talked about this sort of dichotomy. I would say it's a false binary, and there's certainly some areas of overlap and disagreement. Probably not as much as many people who are arguing about it would say. Do you have any concerns, or what do you see from the sort of science of learning kind of perspective that you in terms of either messaging and the perception of that sort of camp, or ways in which it's being applied? So I'll give an example in terms of science of reading, and we've done podcasts on science of reading, and there's now I think it's his name's Mark Seidenberg. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. Talking about taking it to the next step, right? Not getting sort of trapped in silos of just doing phonics, right? That it's important to include other instructional approaches and a variety of things. Are there things like that, or sort of cautionary tales, or things that you see like, oh boy, that's not coming off the way that I wish it would, or things like that with a sort of science of learning kind of crowd? And there doesn't have to be.
I think that the whole phrase science of learning and science of math, it seems that it's sort of almost become politicized, which I think is really unreasonable. I mean, to me, all this is like, so first of all, the phrase science of math, I did not coin that phrase. I know, I got to know Amanda Vanderheyden, and I think she's really awesome, and several other people that are part of that group. I'm not part of that group. The phrase itself, like science of math, kind of doesn't make sense, right? Because math is a subject, and I care about these science things, right? Yeah, right. So, but what they mean by it is, there's all these people out there doing research on math interventions and how to teach math, and let's get that out there. Let's let people hear about it, right? And so I think that's the whole point of it. Unfortunately, it's just, I don't know. I see a lot of research and education that's very, very poor. And, it's, in fact, I saw this being handed out at my own kid's school as evidence for not teaching algorithms. And, I feel like we have to stand up to that sort of stuff. We have to stand up to things that are being used as evidence, but it's like really shoddy research. So I think the science of math movement, I think it's really great. And I think we should be listening to what those researchers are doing and what they can share with us, because I think they have a lot to offer. Because at the end of the day, we need kids to learn math, not just for the economy, but also for them, right? So that they have opportunities, so that they feel good at math, so that doors aren't closed for them. Because when you aren't able to do math, it really does close a lot of doors, and it can close them really early on.
Yeah. Well, as the way that I think about it, and I have, make real criticisms about the sort of deeper learning crowd. I joke about it. it looks Pinterest worthy or TikTok worthy, but are they actually learning? Because if you get to the end of a project-based learning experience, for example, and your question is, oh, what things did they learn, instead of did they learn the things that I wanted them to learn, then you've got a real problem. And so any sort of orthodoxy or rigidity or rejection of the other side, quote unquote, I think is a real problem. And what I get frustrated about, and that's where I get snarky, and what seems to be, I try not to be, but in the sort of science and learning sort of research ed crowd, is this sort of rigidity and sort of narrowness of a set of desirable set of academic outcomes, and not even being willing to consider that there might be something more than just efficiency or knowledge building. And so I see it as a yes and trying to broaden that conversation, which is supported by evidence, but it's different, right? And what I don't want inquiry people to say is that direct or explicit instruction is bad for kids. And I don't want direct or explicit instruction advocates to say that inquiry is bad for kids. It's how do we figure out what's the best approach to getting us where we want to go, and we first have to figure out where do we want to go, and that's a really important piece that can be different in some classrooms, and some people, have different priorities and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say one other thing.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, to be honest, what I care about is content. Like, I care about kids learning the content and liking math. I mean, some people maybe don't like math. I suppose it depends on the reason. But, not everybody has to like math.
Yeah.
But if it's for a bad reason, like I feel like I'm not good at it, or I didn't have a good teacher or something like that, I don't want that. But at the end of the day, I actually care about students learning math content and the math content that will lead them forward, right? So I wish I could say, and I used to think that the answer to all this was, if we could just decide on the content that we want students to learn and have really good tests, do whatever you want with your teaching, right? Like, just do, I don't care. I just want the content. But, and then there are people that are against assessment, and I can't believe it, right? I mean, why would you be against assessment? Because it tells you if children are learning. And I become very suspicious when I hear, like you talked about black and white thinking. That's one that really gets to me. When you hear someone who's against assessment, I think, why are you against assessment? Is it because what you're doing doesn't work? Because assessment will tell us that, right? So I don't know. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it really is about content. And the reason I sort of got into all this other stuff is because it always comes back to pedagogy, because the pedagogy that's often being used isn't getting students to learn the content.
Yeah. Well, Anna, I really appreciate the conversation, and any apologies for being snarky on Twitter before our initial back and forth, and I'm glad that you responded and came on. We don't have to agree, and I think there's some things we don't agree on, and that's okay. And hopefully this conversation is helpful for folks to think through some of the different distinctions and complexities of this, because that's my goal. And we've got to get away from just, blocking and saying, I'm not going to have this conversation. This person's, not on my tribe, and that kind of thing. So I really appreciate the conversation. Any other things that you want to say? The Chalk and Talk podcast, a link, and any social media, anything you want to mention before we jump off?
No, but yeah, for sure. You can find me, my podcast, Chalk and Talk, on all your favorite podcast apps. And happy to have listeners. And I want to thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you reached out to me by email. Interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.